Okay, so we're going to learn two new rules today. One of them is super easy, and we'll save that one for last. So it says evaluate each of the following on your calculator. Express your answer in rational form. So I'm going to type in 2 to the negative first power to see what that looks like. So 2 to the negative first power is 1/2. And I'm going to do the same thing for each of these. So 3 to the negative first is 1/3. 2 to the negative second, oops, it's 1/4. 4 to the negative second is 1/16. 1 over 4 to the negative second is 16. And then finally 1 over 3 to the negative third is a 27. Okay, so by typing in the calculator, that's what it came out to be. So as I'm looking at these, did raising it to a negative power result in a negative answer? So look, I have negative exponents on each of these. But does that mean my answer was going to be negative? No, it does not. So we're trying to figure out what is the rule for when we have a negative exponent. Okay, so the way I think about negative exponents are, first of all, we don't really see negative exponents. They don't look right, okay? And that's because they really aren't right. So I think of them as warning signs. Whenever I see a negative exponent, it's warning me like, hey, I'm in the wrong spot. So watch. This was not a fraction, but I can turn it into a fraction by putting it over 1. All right, so notice this 2 had a negative exponent of 1. So anytime you have something that has a negative exponent saying, hey, I don't belong here, move me. So this 2 was on the top, so I moved it down to the bottom. Notice on this one, this 4 had a negative exponent of 2. This negative exponent is saying, hey, I don't belong down here. I really belonged on the top. That's why it's a whole number now. And we'll get more into it later. But for right now, I want you to think of negative exponents as warning flags saying, hey, I don't belong here. You need to move me. So if it was on the top, you need to move it to the bottom. If it was on the bottom, you need to move it to the top. Okay, so on A, I have x to the negative second power. Whenever I'm dealing with negative exponents, if it's not a fraction, I turn it into a fraction by putting it over 1. So since this x has a negative exponent, it's my warning saying, hey, I don't belong up here. I really belong on the bottom, so I'm going to move my x to the bottom. Okay, when I move it to the bottom, it belongs down there, so I no longer want it to have that warning negative, right? So when I move it to where it belongs, the negative drops off and you leave the number the same. So since this x was on top, that now it moved to the bottom, there's nothing on top, so I have to fill it in with a 1. All right, let's try B. On B, it says 5x to the negative third. So I see a negative exponent. It's not a fraction, so I'm going to turn it into one. Okay, this is where I don't want you to mess up. The 5 and the x are two separate things because they are not in parentheses together. So I look at the 5. The 5 does not have a negative exponent, which means leave it alone. So 5 is on top. This x, on the other hand, does have a negative exponent. So this x is telling me, hey, I don't belong up here. Here's my warning. So since x was on the top, I need to move it to the bottom where it belongs. When you move it where it belongs, remember the warning falls off, so the negative is not going to be there anymore, and it's going to be a positive 3. On C, I have negative 2x to the negative 4th. It's not a fraction, so I'm going to turn it into one. Okay, so I'm going to start with my negative 2. Remember, negative 2 and x are two separate things because they are not in parentheses together. So I look at this negative 2 and I look, does it have a negative exponent? No, it does not. So there's no warning here telling me to move it. So leave negative 2 alone. I know it's a negative, but I don't care. The negative doesn't tell me to move it. A negative exponent does. Since it does not have a negative exponent, I'm going to leave negative 2 on top where it was. Okay, now as I'm looking at the x, notice this x has a negative exponent. So that's telling me the x is in the wrong spot. So I know x really doesn't belong on the top, it belongs on the bottom. So when I move it to where it belongs, the negative falls off and I keep the number. All right, on D I have negative 3, x to the negative 2nd, y to the negative 3rd. I'm going to turn it into a fraction since it's not one. So negative 3, x and y, they are all different things because they're not in parentheses together. So I look at negative 3 first. I check. It does not have a negative exponent, so I'm going to leave it where it is on top. Next, I look at my x. X does have a negative exponent, which is telling me to move it. Since it was on top, I know it belongs on bottom. Make sure you remove the negative. And now I'm going to look at y. I see that y also has a negative exponent, which is telling me, hey, I don't belong up here. So I'm going to move y to the bottom where it belongs, and the negative warning drops off. Okay, on this next one, it already is a fraction, so that's nice. So the first thing I look at is my constants, my regular numbers. I see I have a 1 on top. I have a 2 on bottom. This means divide. So I have 1 divided by 2. Notice neither one of these numbers have a negative exponent. So I just need to see, can I simplify 1 over 2? Well, 1/2 does not simplify, so I'm going to leave it alone. I'm going to leave my 1 on top. I'm going to leave my 2 on bottom. And now I'm going to look at my x's. So I did the regular numbers, so now I'm going to do x's. I look at x and I see that it has a negative exponent. So this guy is telling me, hey, I don't belong down here. So really this x belongs at the top. When I move it where it belongs, the negative falls off, so it's going to be a positive 2. So remember, this 1 out front here isn't necessary. You could leave it like that if you wanted to, but it's not necessary. That's the same thing as saying x squared over 2. All right, f is already a fraction, so that's nice.
Teacher, sorry for the interruption. Can you please release all the seniors to the back right now, please? All the seniors to the back. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm looking at my constants, my regular numbers. I have a 1 on top. I have a 7 on bottom. Neither one of these has a negative exponent or an exponent at all. So I have 1 divided by 7. Well, 1 divided by 7 does not simplify, so it's going to stay 1/7. So a 1 on top, a 7 on bottom. Now I look at my variables. I'm going to look at x first. I notice that this x does have a negative exponent warning me, hey, I don't belong down here. So I'm going to move it to the top where it belongs. And the negative warning falls off, and I'm going to leave it just a positive 4. All right, next I look at my y. My y also has a negative exponent saying I don't belong down here either. So I'm going to move y to the top, and it's going to be a positive 1. Okay, so this answer is correct. It's just not 100% simplified. I know really I don't have to have this leading 1, and I know I don't have to have an exponent of 1. So if I wanted to write this as simply as possible, it would be x to the 4th y over 7. I mean, if you left those ones, I wouldn't count you wrong, but this is the most simplified version. All right, so that was the first rule of the day. Whenever you have a negative exponent, treat it as a warning saying, hey, I'm in the wrong spot, you need to move me. Okay, the next rule. All right, so I'm going to type A, B, and C into my calculator. So 2 to the 0 power, 3 to the 0 power, and 4 to the 0 power. So let's go type those in. So 2 to the 0 power is equal to, 3 to the 0 power is equal to, and 4 to the 0 power. Notice, no matter what it was, if it's raised to the 0 power, it turns it into a 1. So your rule is, when you raise something to a 0 power, it becomes 1. And the reason that's so nice, guys, is because if you turn your variable or whatever your exponent is attached to a 1, most times, guys, we can ignore the 1 like we did over here, right? Because a times 1 does nothing. So most times you can ignore it if it's a 1. An exponent of 1 does nothing. So more times than not, we're going to be able to just ignore it if it has a power of 0. Okay. So now we're going to mix the two up together. So I see a negative exponent. It's not a fraction. I'm going to turn it into a fraction. So I'm going to look at this n first. I see it has a negative exponent. Remember, that's a warning telling me, hey, I don't belong here. So this n does not belong on the top. I'm going to move it to the bottom where it belongs. My negative warning would fall off, and I keep the number. So into the positive fourth. Okay, w has a 0 power. Well, we just learned that a 0 power is going to turn this w into a 1. So really, I have a 1 on top. Okay, on this next one, it's already a fraction. That's nice. I like to go in order. I'm going to start with my constant, my regular number, and then I'm going to go in alphabetical order. So I look for my constants first. I see a 3. That's the only regular number I see, so I'm going to leave it alone. I know that 3 belongs on top. Now I'm going to look at my x. I look at x. It does not have an exponent at all. It doesn't have an exponent, negative exponent. Doesn't have a 0 exponent. So I'm just going to leave this guy alone. He's going to sit on top, exactly where he was. Okay, now I'm going to look at y. I notice it says y to the 0 power. Well, I know that this 0 power is going to turn y into a 1. So on the bottom I have a 1. Next I look at z. I notice that z has a negative exponent. So it's warning me that z does not really belong down here. So I'm going to move z to the top where he belongs. Drop off the negative warning and change it to a positive 3. Okay, so this is what I was talking about, why I love 0 power so much. Do you see how pretty much this, a 1 on bottom, we don't necessarily need to divide by 1 because it does absolutely nothing. So usually whenever you see a variable raised to a 0 power, you can just mark it out. So my final answer is 3xz to the third. Okay, it's already a fraction. So I'm going to deal with my constants first. I see a 2 on top. I see a 3 on bottom. Neither one of those have exponents. So I'm going to go type in 2 divided by 3 in my calculator to see if it simplifies. Notice when I click enter, it shows the exact same thing. And that's because 2 over 3 can't simplify. It's just 2/3. So I have 2 on top, 3 on bottom. Okay, now I'm going to look at my x's. I see my x right here. Notice it has a 0 exponent, which means it's going to turn this x into a 1. So since I already have a 3 on the bottom, I'm going to put times, and I know it turned this guy into a 1, so 3 times 1. Now I'm going to look at my y. I see my y is here with the negative exponent, which is warning me this y does not belong on top. So I'm going to move it to the bottom where it belongs. When I move it, it becomes a positive 3. Okay, I'm not going to leave my answer like this because I can simplify 3 times 1. So I know on the top I have a 2. 3 times 1 on the bottom is a 3. And y to the third. Okay, so again, notice 3 times 1. A times 1 doesn't really do anything, so really, I could have just marked that out. 3 times 1. A times 1 doesn't change anything, so I really could have just crossed that out. Okay, D is kind of weird because it's kind of part fraction, part not. So what I'm going to do is turn it into one big fraction by just extending this guy. So really, I have 9x to the negative second, y to the third on top, and I have 4 on bottom. All right, it's already a fraction, so I'm going to go ahead and start with my constants. I see a 9 on top, a 4 on bottom. Neither one of them have an exponent. So let's go see, does 9 divided by 4 simplify? Notice it stays the same, which means it does not simplify. There is no number other than 1 that will go into both of them. So I'm going to leave my 9 on top and my 4 on bottom. And then I like to work in alphabetical order. So next I'm looking at my x's. I see that this x has a negative exponent, warning me that this x does not really belong on the top. So I move x to the bottom and I change my negative 2 to a positive 2 because now it's where it belongs. And then I look at my y. I see y to the third. This is not a 0 exponent, and it's not negative either. So I know nothing should happen to it. This y to the third should stay on top exactly where it was. All right, on these next two problems, we're going to kind of bring in the past rules that we learned and mix them with today. All right, so I have x to the third times x to the negative 6. So before I worry about turning it into a fraction or whatnot, I see that I have x's over here being multiplied by x's over here. So we learned that when we have x's being multiplied by other x's, we take our exponents and we add them. So I'm going to have x to the 3 plus negative 6 is a negative 3. All right, awesome. I can't leave my answer like this, though, because I see a negative exponent. So now I'm going to turn it into a fraction. My x that has that negative exponent is warning me, hey, I don't really belong up here, so I'm going to move it to the bottom where it belongs and change it to a positive 3. So since this x that was on top moved to the bottom, there's nothing on top, so I'm going to fill it in with a 1. All right, on F, I see two sets of parentheses. So the first thing I look for is on the outside. Do I have an exponent on the outside of the parenthesis? I don't here, and I don't here either. Okay, so I know what this is just telling me to do is to take this group and multiply it by this group. So I look for my constants, my regular numbers. I see a 3 and a negative 4. You treat them like normal, so it's telling me to multiply. So 3 times negative 4 is a negative 12. Okay, then I see x's over here being multiplied by x's over here. So we know that rule is to take those exponents and to add them. So I'm going to write my x. 2 plus negative 7 is a negative 5. Okay, then I'm going to do the same thing for my y's. I have y's here being multiplied by y's over here. So I'm going to take their exponents and add them. Remember, if it's missing, it's an exponent of a 1. So I'm going to take that 1 and that negative 3 and add them. So y, 1 plus negative 3 is a negative 2. Okay, I can't leave my answer looking like that because I see negative exponents. So I turn this guy into a fraction, and I'm going to move everything where it belongs. So the first thing I see is my constant, my negative 12. Notice this negative 12 does not have a negative exponent or any exponent really. So I'm going to leave negative 12 alone. It's going to stay on top. Then I look at my x. I see x does have a negative exponent, warning me this x does not belong up here. So I'm going to move it to the bottom where it belongs and change that negative 5 to a positive 5. Finally, I look at my y, and I see it also has a negative exponent warning me, hey, I don't belong up here. So y also moves to the bottom, and that negative 2 becomes a positive 2.